a very warm welcome, happily not too hot today, to our discussion this morning. Both to those of you here in the room at Box Park, which I can just about see over the lights, and also to those of you who are watching the session via the live stream. I'm Rebecca Evans. I'm Head of Infrastructure at ING, the Strategic Communications Specialist for the Built World, and I'm really happy to be here as your panel chair for this session this morning. So, new towns are back. We don't yet know where they'll be, but we do know that the government has high hopes for them. So the next wave of new towns, if you will, are being presented as a solution, at least in part, to a long list of problems that need fixing. Housing need, of course, but also economic need, and also limited labour mobility, worsening public health, disrupted education. There's a long list. So no wonder that the New Towns Task Force has described them as a generational opportunity. And we've got to be ambitious, right? So surely new towns and places are an opportunity, not just to decide where new communities should be created, but also to reimagine how we want to live. Of course, this isn't the first time we've built new towns in this country. We've had post-war new towns, we've had a couple of waves of new towns in the 60s, and numerous other new and extended housing developments that we can look back and learn from. And that's exactly what we're going to do in this morning's discussion. We're going to consider what we can learn from the past, and if we consider new towns as a clean slate, as it says in the title of the session, a fresh opportunity to consider what we want to create for the future. And I'm really pleased to be joined by the ideal panel to share their thinking and their expertise in this area. Just spend a couple of minutes introducing them so you all know what they bring to the discussion, because it's a really nice mix. So I'm delighted to introduce, here on my left, Soham Day is a director and co-founder at urban design and architecture practice Eco-Responsive Environments. And Soham's also co-author of the book of the same name. Soham's recent projects include a modern-day garden city master plan and an award-winning regeneration master plan for a mixed-use zero-carbon neighbourhood. Next to him, we have John Lewis, Executive Director at Peabody, where he's leading the regeneration of Thamesmead, described as London's new town. His new town pedigree also includes previous roles as CEO of Letchworth Garden City Heritage Foundation and CEO of Milton Keynes Partnership, and he's a resident of Milton Keynes to boot. Next to him, we have Michael Chang, Associate Town Planner and Health Planning Lead at NHS Property Services, or Town Planner with a Health Twist, as I've noticed it says on his LinkedIn page. Michael has also worked at the Department of Health, and he was involved in the Healthy New Towns programme in 2019. And then last but not least, Hilary Satchwell is a Director of Tibbald's Planning and Urban Design, who is passionate about design and creating places with people at their heart. And she's delivered a range of award-winning projects, including new settlements, large-scale urban extensions, estate and urban regeneration projects. So the panel are going to share their thoughts and provocations with us till around 10 or just after, and then we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for questions from you in the room. So do get your thinking caps on as to what you'd like to ask our panel. So I'm going to dive straight in. Just like to start by asking each of you in turn the same question to start with. In one sentence, if possible, if you could choose one thing that you would most like to see done differently in the next generation of new towns, and one thing, if there is one that you'd like to retain, can you tell us what that is? So,
thanks, Rebecca. To keep it really short, I would say design out car dependency.
Thank you. John?
Oh, blimey, I wasn't really there. That really was short. Oh, well
that's
done.
to change.
Yes, please, yeah.
Well, I can understand that from a lot of the original new towns. Fair point, actually. No, mine actually is slightly longer, but I was just going to say that for me, it's about ambition, future-looking, and a sense of excitement. I think when the new towns were put out, particularly the ones in the 60s, there was a real sense of opportunity. It was about a new lifestyle. You were moving to somewhere that could give you employment, housing, education. And I'm slightly worried the current new towns agenda is a bit like, could you just get a load of houses built? And so I just think capturing the ambition of the whole place is what we really need to see.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things that stood out from the Healthy New Towns program, apart from the healthy bit of the New Towns program, was that the NHS and the local government public health teams were actually involved in the delivery and planning of those places across the country. And Sir Malcolm Grant, who was the NHS England chair at that point in time, he's quite a prominent planning lawyer. He did say that at that point in time, it was the first time the NHS has collectively and corporately made building for health a priority by working in those places. It won't be the last time, and hopefully it won't be the only time that we've done that going forward.
Great, thanks. And Hilary?
Brilliant, thank you. So it's slightly similar to things other people are saying. I really think that we should keep this ambition, particularly around scale, particularly around focusing on what we're creating over the long term, and understand that these aren't 5, 10-year things. These are 20, 30, 40, 50-year programs. So I think scale of ambition. And I think the thing I would change is not really focusing them around the needs of the car more than the needs of people. So I think that's very similar. But I think at the time that lots of the 1960s and 70s new towns were being built, we hadn't really understood what the impact of the car and that car dependency was going to be. So there's plenty we can learn, but we need to think big and think exciting and people at the heart of it.
Yeah, great. Okay, so it's just sticking with a little bit more around what we can sort of carry forward and what we should leave behind. You've just talked there about the car. What does that need? What are the sort of specifics there around what's worked and what hasn't worked and why?
So I think what we've got, or we've had until recently, is a legacy of thinking and somehow setting up a system where the car is at the top of the pile, and everything else, when you're planning a new place, has to fit around what the car wants. A lot of this is because of how highways authorities work. And where you've got control, where you've got agency. And we just need to flip that diagram. We've all seen that triangular diagram with people and pedestrians at the top and private vehicles at the bottom. We actually need to do what that diagram tells us and plan people routes first, active, sustainable travel, and we build the other things around. It's not an anti-car movement. It's not a no cars. It's really about providing choice and making sure we plan it to actually work for people first. And I think that we've got some evidence, we've got some understanding of how that can be. We need to have everyone around the table really helping make that happen.
So you mentioned cars as well, and you've worked on sort of reimagining garden cities. Are there things from the original garden cities that we should retain or, again, carry forward?
Absolutely. It's kind of, I suppose, to go forward, sometimes it'll be useful to learn from the past, and garden city thinking has been a precursor to the New Towns idea. And what they really thought about it, and the way they thought about it, is to identify sites that already has got an existing railway infrastructure, or if there is a planned one, so that allows easy access to the nearby towns as a connected city. So imagining as growth clusters around railway corridors, and then having a mesh of active travel network. So one could almost imagine if the town center or the town in itself grows from, let's say, a train station, and then the extent of the settlement could be almost 20-minute cycle ride. All within a very connected pedestrian network, which could be supported also by a public transport, buses, which is a great challenge that we all see in most suburban areas. And one of the problems for that has been, I think, that's another elephant in the room, is the density question. Low densities have always been a problem for supporting public transport in terms of subsidies, and car dependency kind of takes sort of creeps in lack of that. So I think having a railway sort of led, sort of transit-oriented approach meshed by low carbon and active travel route is probably a good starting point.
Thanks. And Hilary, I know you've got an interest in density as well. Again, are there sort of specific lessons that we can learn from previous developments that we want to leave behind or indeed keep?
I mean, I think previous developments, but just previous places people like living have varied density. They have places that are higher density, they have apartments, they have a whole mix of different things going on, as well as homes, and that brings difference in the place. We're not very good, or we've not been very good at delivering new places at scale that achieve that range and variation in density. So kind of have a focus at the moment on medium density, sort of 3 to 7 stories, and thinking about what that would add. There's quite a number of barriers to why that doesn't get delivered, but we've got to unpick that if we want real places that have the richness, variety and interest of good existing places that people love living.
What stops that happening, or what has tended to stop that happening?
Generally, it's harder for house builders to build that. They've got to decide to build the whole block rather than they can build the houses when they need them. There's resistance in the market. You're building circulation space that you've then got to manage, which you don't have to do if you're just building houses. There's all sorts of issues around common hold, leasehold, cladding that put people off the idea of buying something where they don't own the freehold. And I think so we've just got to unpick those things that people need. But lots of young people want to buy into somewhere, or they want to live somewhere, and we're not really offering all of those choices in the way that we could at the moment.
And Michael, just thinking perhaps about cars and maybe even about density, when we think about what we can learn from perhaps the Healthy New Towns programme, but also more generally thinking about the importance of health in creating new places, how do we join up those agendas? Presumably, designing for fewer cars is also part of designing communities that are more healthy places.
Yeah, I mean, I found a really interesting quote from a book called Building Healthy Places. It's from America, actually, but the quote goes something like this. You can transpose it to the UK context. It says that modern America, or modern Britain, has been pretty much been unhealthy in terms of physical inactivity, obesity, and those kind of issues. But we have made that happen. We have legislated for them. We have planned those places. And therefore, if we were the problem, we are the problem, then we can be the solution. So one of the things that I do say is that planning for health, or at least planning for healthy new towns, won't happen by default. We will design quite high quality place, I'm pretty sure, because of people in the room. But planning for good health and bad health will require conscious decision to design in those health elements and involving the health community in the process. And that's easier said than done. And actually just involving the health sector is a challenge in itself. But I think the procedural elements shouldn't be missed out from the New Towns program. Yes, we want to achieve outcomes like active travel, green space provision, but the process of getting there, that's where we need to focus on the delivery elements of it.
John, just coming back to where you started and thinking about that sort of sense of excitement, how do we bring people along with these things, whether it's designing out cars or thinking about mixed density or designing in for health? Maybe you've got example from Thamesmead in terms of are there legacy elements from New Towns that you've brought forward in terms of that excitement, but other ways that you're having to get people on board?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things, actually. Firstly, just sticking with the car point, I don't think we should underestimate why some people might choose to live out of urban centres. So the convenience factor, the space factor is massively important. So when you talk to people who perhaps aren't all urbanites, who don't particularly like dense living, if you start to suggest we're going to try and introduce urbanised thinking into a place that might mean you haven't got a nice garden, you can't put your car at the front of your house, it's a massive thing to start removing. So what we've got to do is make sure people don't feel they're losing things. It's got to be about convenience in maybe a different way. But I certainly know from a Milton Keynes perspective, when that was designed, the cycleways and walkways were actually designed as leisure routes. They weren't designed for getting from A to B. They were just pleasurable things to do because the A to B factor was going to be your car. And that has really dominated the design layouts of the suburban areas that are sort of the grid squares within Milton Keynes. But it works incredibly well. So that's my point about if you start, we tried to bring in different designs and greater density, and it was really, really difficult. And all you did was bring in some different styles of development. Different people bought them, and then you had everyone who was clinging on for dear life to their detached house and driveway. So you just need to make sure that don't disregard what people like, but there are other ways of bringing in, I think, development styles, development layouts that people will start to sort of move towards when they see the benefits, as long as there are services around them. And the worst thing I think we're seeing at the moment is people are saying, right, we're going to have denser developments without any public transport, and you're nearly getting the worst of all worlds. So some of the later phases of Milton Keynes are not anywhere near as well laid out as the original stuff. So I think we just need to recognise what are we really trying to introduce. Because you've got, in my view, in urbanisation, you've got to have everything. You can't just add little bits.
Yeah, and in Thamesmead, you've obviously got an existing community. It's a vast and exciting regeneration. How are you striking the balance between the existing community and thinking as well about, you know, people that you want to attract into the area?
I think, I mean, interesting again, that was quite car-based when it was originally designed, so there was quite a lack of pavements, which is quite interesting, so people just drove to their individual areas they lived, and so there wasn't a huge amount of walking and cycling at all, really low percentages, and we're trying to improve that in terms of, again, layouts and designs and access to public spaces. We've been really lucky to have the Elizabeth line come to Thamesmead, so coming to Abbey Wood, that has really changed how people perceive the area. And in fact, on our new developments, which are higher density than some of the original development in the area, has resulted in Bexley Council still wanting some parking on site, but actually none of it's been taken up by residents because they just don't need it. And that is purely because the infrastructure is really solid. It's there. Why do you need a car? But we're not saying to people don't have one. And then, of course, we can start designing around that. Not all of Thamesmead is very well served, which is why we're plugging the DLR very heavily to very much the Greenwich side at the moment, because the transport there is quite poor and people are still very dependent on parking, which has meant the town centre is very much like a district centre, lots of parking, convenience stores, nothing else. We need to change the infrastructure, then we can start bringing in the excitement of much higher quality urban development.
Okay. I'm keen now to sort of talk a lot more about the future and how we plan over time. Perhaps we could stick with Thamesmead, though, for a minute. How are you going about sort of creating the identity or recreating the identity of that place?
Well, I think the first thing we did, actually, which was really interesting, when we started, we found that Thamesmead, how do I put this gently, that a lot of people weren't big fans, really, externally, but people who lived there were massive fans. They'd happily moan about it and say it's not a great place. If you then started to agree with them, they were really defensive and say, I think you'll find, actually, it's fantastic. What we realised is the sort of level of civic pride was really low, actually. People felt they were, some people actually, to quote someone, said that they feel it's like a place people have forgotten. So there was quite a sense of, look, we'd love this to be great, but it isn't. And so one of the things we did was through the development of a cultural programme. In fact, Adriana's here actually today, if you've got any questions. We nicked her from the Olympic Park a few years ago to basically create a cultural programme for Thamesmead, which was introducing a whole range of artistic and cultural activities, big events, down to re-livening the local festival that had stopped sort of 15 years before, which suddenly just made things that were really interesting happen in Thamesmead. And to get residents saying things like, we can't believe this has happened in our area, was a massive leap forward. But also what it did is, as a counterbalance to that, was made people who had no idea where Thamesmead even was to look at it, because they were coming to just some great events that happened to be in the area. It brought public spaces alive. People started to look at their parks differently. They started to realise that this was potentially a really, really exciting area. So we were able to invest in that programme. We've managed to continue that and learnt a huge amount from it. But that is about just giving core excitement into an area before you start doing the big things, which are knocking stuff down, rebuilding stuff, changing road layouts, but actually giving a nice backbone for people to really start celebrating where they live already.
Something to hold on to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And Hilary, when you do get into sort of thinking about the big stuff, how do you plan for the needs of a place or a town to change over time when you're at the beginning of thinking about that place?
There's some really tricky things there. I think the point about building in culture is a really important one. Imagine if we have new towns with kind of cultural programs that are about how you build the community, how you get people to feel the energy of being a pioneer, of moving into a new town, and what you then do. So what's interesting about kind of the new towns that we had in the 60s and 70s is, and it's still true of lots of new development outside of big cities today, generally you get lots of families with young children moving in the first kind of 10, 20 years. it can take up to 50 years for a place to settle down with a kind of mixed and balanced community of people of different ages, different income levels, different profiles, for a place really to sort out. What that can often mean is you need, for example, tons of schools for the first 10 to 20 years, and then you don't need them all after that because the numbers have sort of regularised and sort themselves out. So there is a need to firstly do things in a kind of meanwhile short-term way to get it going. Then you need some things permanently for a bit, and then you maybe don't need those things. So we never really should think about places as permanent and fixed. They've always got to evolve. And so this is a thing we find quite hard, I think, because infrastructure is expensive. And once you've built it, you don't want to imagine that it might only be for 5, 10 years. I think we are seeing people start to build much more flexibly around infrastructure. One of the Healthy New Towns projects we've been working on for a number of years in Northstowe in Cambridge, they're looking at building a flexible market hall that could be demountable, it could be moved to different places, it can be used for different things over time. So how do you get things that are both infrastructure and culture and community all together without thinking, oh my God, I've spent many millions on that, it has got to be perfect? Because that's not how things are.
Yeah.
It's also great if the new community can then have a say and be involved in the stewardship of those uses and kind of how that then works. And that's what you want. You want that ship to be kind of have people on it when it starts moving.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually how. I mean, we think of master planning and it's sort of baked into the word in a way as these big ideas at the start. But how does one transition from master planning and all that involves to long-term stewardship of a place, and whose role is it to make sure that happens?
There's a particular challenge in that you need to hold on to a vision and a really clear idea about the positive qualities of something you want to create over a very long time. You need a lot of organisational memory to keep going with that, but it's also got to have the ability to be flexible.
Yeah.
So having the continued thread running for 20, 30 years, but at the same time as coping with, we did that, it didn't quite work, so let's change. So I think particular people and particular mindsets really work with that. If you think, well, I'm delivering this thing no matter what, it's not going to work. If equally you think, well, what they said before, I don't know why they decided that and we'll just chuck it out, that doesn't work either. So you've got it's a really interesting and quite different way of thinking.
Yeah. And sort of sticking with that idea of the need for flexibility over time and for infrastructure that's flexible, I'm keen to talk about health and in a minute about resilience and sustainability as well. So Michael, I mean, health outcomes are a thing that often we sort of only see with hindsight. How does one go about building in or considering? I mean, you also talked about the difficulty of bringing in that sometimes the health community at the right times. How does one build that in so there is the needed flexibility around health outcomes as well?
I mean, there is a challenge in the health sector in terms of how they engage with the development, because they're very good at looking at past trends. I'm saying they're probably less good at projecting forwards, and that's where the learning curve was and should still be from the Healthy New Towns program. But one of the key strands of the Healthy New Towns program was community activation. So how do you build the community from the existing community, knowing their needs, which are obviously very, very different to how we kind of perceive them if you're not working within the health sector. So I think identifying those needs quite early on the process, the procedural elements of it, the visioning is really quite key. One final thing is looking at the people working in them. I think one of the key learning from the Healthy New Towns program was you need people in the right place at the right time and sustained over a long period of time. The challenges of the Healthy New Towns program was that people kind of went in and out of the sector or the program. And so that's where you kind of lose the health focus throughout the program. And obviously, Northstowe was a healthy new town. It was an eco-town. It probably will be another new town. And so these places have been around for decades. And therefore, if you lose the people, lose the institutional memory, then you do lose a lot of flexibility and the things that you do need to plan into these places throughout the whole program.
Lot there to think about. And so, we've talked about sort of master planning, long-term stewardship, thinking about sort of, climate resilient futures. How do those two things, or more than two things really, need to come together? Does master planning work for thinking about climate resilience?
Absolutely, and I think just kind of carrying on what Michael just mentioned about healthy placemaking. I think I would probably go a bit beyond just addressing housing crisis or building homes. And I think maybe our focus needs to shift more towards the deeper layers of the settlement, like the water, the soil, biodiversity, social infrastructure, right at the outset, because they take very, very long time to establish. And perhaps reimagine new towns more like a living system. And therefore I suggest, and we've talked about active travel, but I think I suggest two major shifts in terms of reimagining master planning. First one being, maybe we could go beyond thinking about site boundaries, beyond administrative, conventional administrative boundaries, but planning by watersheds. Because when we think about planning by watersheds, our focus automatically goes towards understanding how water flows through the land. Where are the floodplain areas? Instead of reacting towards flooding and water scarcity, we can manage and plan our settlements by thinking about actions that are happening at the upstream and how do they affect downstream at the outset without reacting towards it when the problem is already there. And creating local water cycles. So I think there's a lot of potential in terms of thinking about watersheds as site boundaries, since I think new towns offer that opportunity to think about settlements at a very large scale. The other one would be thinking or reimagining our countryside edge. Currently, we sort of, there's a lot of arguments against building on green belts, and there's a lot of sort of outlash from that. How about thinking about green growth corridors, where imagining strategic corridors where settlements can grow into the nature instead of growing over it. In that way, there's equitable access to green open spaces, better opportunities for biodiversity integration, and there's opportunities for food production, and there's so many sort of fundamental stuff that we can achieve by thinking about these blue and green systems right at the outset.
Yeah. It sounds really exciting. Do you think that in general people are thinking in that way? I mean, given the emphasis on housing numbers and need, which is undeniable that there's housing need, but actually, does that overtake, or can the two things work together?
I think there is a growing understanding of it, obviously with this advent of climate change, and I think a few days ago we were really feeling the heat of it, although they're not necessarily everyday occurrences, but it's growing, and I think that is pushing the sort of agenda, the urgency of thinking about blue and green systems hand in hand by into delivering homes, because it's not just homes that we are trying to picture, it's living, because by having a new home, but having a very difficult time in terms of getting access to water and green open spaces doesn't give you everything. So I think it needs a holistic approach, and I think it is growing as a design intent.
Okay, well, that's good news. I'm keen to hear what people in the room think as well. So we'll open up to questions now. I know there's a mic that can come round. If you'd like to stick your hand up, I can hopefully see you. You might need to wave slightly. Chap here in the white shirt. You could say who you are, and if your question is for a particular person, that's helpful as well.
Yeah, it's not to a particular person. My name's Duncan Bennett. I'm head of planning at Located. My question is about what's the optimum management structure for new towns? You're going to have a lot of new towns coming forward in the next few years. Lots of conflicting priorities, and these decisions are quite difficult.
You mean at an overall level, or
no, for each individual new town? There's, you're going to have the commercial realities of developers. Mm-hmm. You're going to have the local authorities' position. You're going to have the environmental interests and priorities.
Yep.
It's going to be very difficult. And so what's the optimum management arrangement for it? Because it's quite a challenge.
John, do you've got a view on that?
Yeah, good question, actually. I think putting aside issues around local authorities, etc., I think some form of stewardship trust is a really, really interesting model. Obviously, Letchworth still flies the flag for the original Garden City model, which is a really, really powerful way of earning within a town and then being able to use all that money to reinvest in infrastructure and community facilities. Thamesmead has some of that as well that's still happening, that we've been able to pick up the mantle as a long-term steward ourselves with an absolute commitment to be there in perpetuity. And what you need, picking up on the point around long-term planning, large-scale development, recognising how long everything takes. If you put the sort of trust model in at the beginning and start to build income streams that can be owned by the town and reinvested in the town, you'll start to see that all the infrastructure that's built relatively quickly also fails relatively quickly. Therefore, you need to manage it in bulk. And all those things need, if they're addressed up front, which they absolutely can be, especially if you're starting with a blank piece of paper and you've got the effectively an undeveloped space, you really can start to see how you can secure income streams to protect the future. Probably the largest scale version of this is the Milton Keynes Parks Trust, which was set up to basically manage the green spaces at no cost to local residents by being given an endowment of about 20 million quid worth of property. They've managed to grow that since they were set up to over £100 million worth of value. And they spend something around, I think, £8 to £10 million a year just investing in the parks. So if you live there, no cost to a resident. They are way above anything I've ever seen in terms of our own Thamesmead management, I should quickly say, of park areas. But it is phenomenal and free to residents because someone thought about it at the outset. That could have been extended across the whole town. Politics gets in the way of that, as you can imagine, but if we had some real foresights of local councillors recognising that they could be trustees rather than councillors, they might start to see the opportunity of what really could be brought into place, in my view.
Anyone else want to come in on that? I'm quite interested in. I'm interested in whether everyone agrees with John or whether there's any other views on the panel. Hilary first, and then we'll come to you.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with John on the kind of management once you're building things. I think there's something really important through the delivery stage that leads into the management. We've got to take these things out of political cycles. We can have politicians establish them, we can have it set up, we can agree the vision, but we can't deliver long-term good places with the flip-flopping of policy and the flip-flopping of what we need. So they need a constant support broadly across the spectrum to really make sure that they work.
I was wondering what Hilary mentioned earlier about organizational memory, and I think that concept goes very well with this idea of trusts. And perhaps, we've seen how new towns were developed via development corporations. Maybe they could be called development cooperatives. And maybe Homes England could be called Towns England, where there's more than just focusing on one bit, but rather than a holistic approach that allows for value capture reinvested for the community benefit.
Really quickly, I think some of the public service infrastructure providers will possibly not fit within a standard, management structure, the NHS, for example, and I wonder how they will be managed through that kind of trust. So I think it's really interesting that the government is working across government departments in planning for these new towns programs, because the fact that they need to bring in NHS, DFE, education, transport, because they can't be managed altogether, like some of the other kind of infrastructure within the new town. So the challenge is bringing those conversations. I kind of wonder how many in the room are from the NHS, from the health sector, or from the other non-housing or development sectors, because they need to be involved in conversations around management. Otherwise, we have a very fragmented way of managing different infrastructure within the new towns, and that is continually the challenge, and the cost will also be fall back on the residents to pay through service charges and things like that.
Yeah, John, you want to come back in?
I was going to say that I think with the new towns or another wave of new towns, the opportunity to really look through the place lens is so, it's just too big an opportunity to miss. So the whole issue around infrastructure of organisations is what you could undo, because if you start with how are we going to manage this place long term, I don't want to hear about the national arrangement of the NHS or the national arrangement of, I don't know, the fire service. No, what do we need here, and can we work from that upwards? And I think because all of us, whether you're a professional or just someone because you happen to live there, you've all got a view. We all know what does and doesn't work, but for some reason we overly professionalise it. We make it more and more distant from where we're actually talking about. And if we could reverse that, I think we'd be in a much stronger position.
Interesting balance to strike. More questions, please? Lady there. Any other hands that I can see while I'm looking out and about the room? There's one at the back afterwards as well.
This is one for John Lewis. I know that Peabody's Lodestar for Thamesmead was a strategic framework rooted in the landscape, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how that's developed over the last few years.
Could you just repeat the question from the beginning? I didn't quite hear it.
Yes, of course. I know that Peabody's Lodestar for Thamesmead was a strategic framework called Living in the Landscape, and I wondered how that was panning out.
Oh, right, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we, again, just in terms of, I suppose, some of the points you made actually about landscape, I think a massive success at Thamesmead from its outset was its commitment to green space and making most of the water management, creating lakes and parks. And we had the fortune of appointing Phil Askew to our Director of Landscape, who led that Living in the Landscape strategy, which is a 30-year plan to match our own Thamesmead 30-year plan, to make sure that we can not just look after all the green spaces, but actually elevate them into a much more usable opportunity for residents. We've done a number of green improvement projects across the town over the last 5 years, and we continue to take forward that in sort of chunks of work. There were some very ambitious projects in there. Some of them won't be delivered in the short term because they're just hugely expensive, but it doesn't mean we haven't got the ambition to do them. But really, really pleased with the way things have progressed.
Thank you. And there's a question at the back from a lady who I think sat down again now. There she is. Any more? Anyone want to wave while we're getting the mic to the back?
Hello. I'm Marsha Ramroop. I'm an inclusion strategist and written Building Inclusion. I know Hilary will know I have an answer to this particular question, but I'm curious to know what the panel's view is on having big ambition but delivering with agility in really small ways, multiply across with sort of regenerative housing zones in a way that far more, repetitive across the country, and doing that with big ambition but more agility. How possible do you think that is? How easy do you think it is to convince our politicians that we can do that at scale?
Okay, thank you. That's an interesting question. Hilary, do you want to start then?
I'm interested what do you mean by agility? Do you mean our ability to do different things, or ability
both
to think differently about people?
Both an ability to do things differently, but also to do things quickly, but with that alternative thinking of regenerative approaches.
I think we'd say over the last decade, 20 years, we haven't really become any more agile as a sort of big industry delivering housing. It is a thing that we need to think a little bit more about. At the moment, a lot of so we can plan whatever we like upstream. It's thinking about all the different players as you go through, thinking at very strategic level, very high level, through developing a framework, through sorting out what you're going to deliver and how that's going to work, and then who actually builds it in the end. And the who it builds it in the end has quite a lot of control over whatever you say at the beginning being able to happen. And we need agility. People have been talking for 25 years about us needing more SME builders, about us being able to support different models of delivery, but somehow we never make it easier for that to happen. But no one's planning that to not happen, but I think it's a real problem. There are a lot of people thinking about that, but it's something that we really need to focus on. We need a much more agile set of people who are able to deliver and get on with things, and for not everything to be re-questioned, reconsidered at every point, which is kind of where we are at the moment. We need the ability to have hope and to say, yes, this could be really good. Is this going to be good? Well, let's try it.
Hope with agility is a
hope
good
and agility
would
would be
aim.
a great ambition, yeah.
Sam, do you want to talk a little bit about speed, maybe, in relation to agility? I mean, just before we started, you and John were talking about Letchworth and the time it takes for things to actually happen from master plan to delivery.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about it when this question was up. I mean, it's not necessarily very fast unless you've got massive political will backing up these ideals. Because there's always, since there's like different agendas amongst people, there's so much friction. But as a part of master planning process that we were doing in Letchworth, we started with the community first approach. Before we drew a single line on paper, we engage with the community, which is probably not the very conventional approach that most projects go through. We started designing and made them understand what a design process is like and what are the agendas that we need to address that goes beyond personal interests, where everyone therefore understood that this is not just my own need, but it's something that as a community as a whole we want to build. When that sort of agenda gets established amongst sort of the bigger picture, I think then from onwards it becomes a lot more easier and relatively quicker process. But more and more you engage with the community, it does, in a way, I would say, it doesn't make the process very fast, but I would say it's a very definitely integral part of design process that makes, I would say, a lot of abortive work or cost in terms of time in the future that we can avoid by building the right stuff in the beginning.
Okay, thank you. Was there a question over here that I couldn't see? I think we're coming to the end of our time. There's one there. Tom. This one there. Final question.
Hi, Tom from Ing Media. Hi, Rebecca. The panel's been at pains to take politics out of this discussion, so I apologise for bringing it in at the end. But the reality of the situation is that these new towns, the hope is that we start building them in 2029. Currently, there's a devolution bill going through Parliament, which is going to create a raft of new metro mayors, some of which are probably going to be from populist or populist-leaning parties. North Stowe has come up a couple of times in this panel, and the newly elected metro mayor for Cambridgeshire, the first thing he's done in power is say he's going to end the, in his words, ridiculous war on cars. So how are we going to be able to win the argument outside of Festival of Place and in the places where these towns are going to be built, where there is perhaps a new political reality of populism?
Thanks, Tom. John, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That's a great question. Yeah.
Thanks,
Tom. Well, this is going to be a bit of a soft answer, really. I think it is about, dare I say it, the will of the people. And I will use the Letchworth example. When we worked there, and the idea of building new housing in one of the most protected parts of Hertfordshire, in my view, was like everyone said, oh, you won't, no one's interested. It was a sacrosanct, can't touch the green belt. So we just literally went round, we dropped postcards through doors and asked them to return them. So this was a bit, you can see how many years ago it was. And we just said, do we need more homes in Letchworth? And we were literally hit with, I think it was over 80% positive, yes, we do. And then we were able to say, well, where should we put them? And that started the dialogue. And I think that's the sensibility of how one needs to work, really practical, really sensible, and then you start taking it forward. When you come in with, dare I say it, developer-led master plans where you say, we're going to build this, what do you think? You're going to see that as an unquestionable disaster, really. And I think that's where you need to come through it. So a populist mayor will work to what the popular people are saying. So make sure that you're asking the right questions and then build a consensus, which isn't necessarily very difficult these days with social media. But I just think we've got to recognise that most balanced people are saying that we need more homes in this country, but let's do it really well, and that's what we need to get into.
Okay, thank you. I think. Do you want to come in?
I just think it's worth saying that I don't think there is a war on cars in the way people that imagine, but we need to really up the game in the conversation we're having, which is that if we plan, we basically can't build our way out of everybody being able to drive everywhere all at once and not getting stuck at traffic. That's not a thing that can happen. So we need to have a different conversation that says, in order to make it easier for those that want to and need to drive, we need to provide alternatives for other people so that it's not everybody on the road all at once at the same time. So it's a much more balanced conversation, which is a much harder one to have, but we do need to be having that much more balanced conversation, which can meet a much wider range of needs and I believe actually works better for everybody.
Great. We're pretty much out of time. I'm going to stick just quickly with your theme of hope, Hilary, and just ask each of you, what is your sort of top hope for the next wave of new towns, in brief?
I think again, hope is a great agenda. Although I would say hope is not necessarily our plan, but we should aspire for building the deeper layers of the settlement, as I have been mentioning, first, because that lays the foundation of a great placemaking where everyone can live and manage at the same time.
Okay.
So it is that supports life.
Great, thank you, John.
Well, my hope is that Thamesmead gets designated a new town in the rollout. So
that's very
fine.
straightforward. Michael?
My hope is getting health in the new towns, wherever they are. No one can disagree with poor health or good health, you know. So health is a key message. Will get you delivered on the new towns.
And Hilary, what for you?
I hope that we make every decision as if people mattered.
Excellent. All right. Thank you all very much for coming and listening today and for all your questions. If you will join me in thanking our panel, who've been excellent this morning, Soham, John, Michael and Hilary.
Thank you.